Elliott. I am a doctoral candidate at Kennesaw University in Georgia in the International Conflict Management Program. And I'm here to give you a presentation on Islamic State propaganda, and specifically how to counter it, what best way to counter it, and also who can help us counter it in a counter-propaganda campaign. I first started analyzing Islamic State propaganda when I worked at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and we looked at all aspects of their propaganda, and which took the form of one major incident was more, I could say, performance art, when they blew up all the artifacts and ancient structures in Palmyra. Then they also have videos, a whole wide range of videos, execution videos, recruitment, what have you, Twitter, Facebook. But my focus is on a long-form magazine called Dabiq, and I'll tell you why. I'll explain that in a little while in a couple of slides. Some of their successes were really unprecedented in Islamic State, and from now on I'm going to, in this presentation, I'll refer to Islamic State as Daesh because it's derogatory, and mostly because they don't like it. I forget what the acronym stands for, but so their successes were unprecedented. They were on a global scale. They recruited, for the first time in history, tens of thousands of fighters from around the world, from different countries, speaking different languages, to come and fight in Syria and Iraq. Not only to fight on the ground in Syria and Iraq, but they also inspired terrorist attacks in Europe and other places. This had never happened. And it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the internet. Like, it wouldn't have been possible without the internet or social media. And then there's also something very particular about Islamic State's idea of a global caliphate as well. There were some setbacks in their campaign. One was when the alliance forces realized that they named their magazine Dabiq after a city that was of no strategic military value, but they used it to further their apocalyptic narrative. They found an obscure passage in the Quran that said something to the effect of, like, the last true believers will make their last stand in Dabiq. So they staked their claim on, that was one of the things, the identifying factors of Islamic State that distinguished them from Al-Qaeda, was that they could hold and control the territory. And so it meant something that they held the city of Dabiq. Well, probably the most effective propaganda, counter-propaganda coup that Western forces achieved was to actually realize that and purposely take Dabiq just to mess with their narrative. So, and they did, and that's why there's only 15 issues of Dabiq. After that, they changed the name to Rumea, which is Arabic for Rome. So that was one setback for them. The other was right around the same time of the publishing of the 15th issue of Dabiq. Its chief chief editor was killed in a drone strike. So, and I'll get back to that in a little while. So the co-religionist hypothesis, what is it? That's my research question. The co-religionist hypothesis posits that in a conflict that in which religion is a major factor, the best person or institution to intervene peacefully is someone of the same religion as the belligerents. In other words, if there's a village with Hindus and Buddhists and they are in conflict, if it's the Hindus that are probably going to attack next, it's the best person to try to persuade them not to attack the Buddhists would be a fellow Hindu, preferably someone who's a religious leader. If religion is a major factor in the conflict. So why does it matter? That's I would say, the most important question for any research project. The reason it matters is that people are dying. And if we can determine if the co-religionist hypothesis is predictive, then we can actually use it to inform future counter-propaganda campaigns. Okay, so this is an 80-page lit review boiled down to 3 points. Some key concepts. Fundamentalism religious fundamentalism is very important to understand if you're looking at Islamic State. There's some key characteristics about fundamentalists, and they apply across the board to every major world religion. One is they tend to have very patriarchal societies. They tend to be obsessed with an apocalyptic narrative. They tend to place an extraordinary value on the exact wording of their sacred text, whether it be the Bible, the Quran, what have you, and that will become important in a second. The second important concept is the ambivalence of the sacred, which is a fancy way of saying that the sacred texts of every major world religion have passages that could be interpreted to endorse violence or even command violence up to acts of genocide. And there are also in every single sacred text of every major world religion passages that would tell you to love your neighbor and to be peaceful. So you can use this, a religious leader can use this idea or this reality to his or her advantage. Whether this person would like to incite violence, they can cherry pick certain passages, or if they want to promote peace, they can do the same with different passages. Then the conventional wisdom on the co-religionist hypothesis. The few writers that write about this, the few scholars, tend to assume that it is predictive. But the nonprofits, the very few nonprofits that work with the goal of using religion as a tool for peace building are mixed on which interveners are the best people to use, to recruit. Should they be like interfaith? Should they be secular? Should they be co-religionists? The Carter Center where I worked goes on the assumption that the co-religionists are probably the best bet. But where I am trying to fill the gap is it's never been proven with data. It's an assumption. Okay, so here, speaking of assumptions, my assumptions. Daesh propagandists are rational. A lot of people think that if somebody has an ideology that makes them go blow up a building, like a suicide attack, then that person is crazy. The literature does not say that. In fact, they're quite rational, and especially the propagandists are extremely intelligent. I mean, look at the success that they've had. It's never happened before. Also, an assumption I make, because they're not stupid, Daesh propagandists know that their life expectancy is pretty low, because the US government, the most obvious misstep was President Obama referred to ISIS as the JV League of jihadists, completely underestimated their capacity to spread their propaganda. And I would say that this current administration is even far worse, if that's possible, at dealing with this issue. Therefore, I say that in the issues of DAPIC, which 15 issues went over the course of about 2.5 years, I would predict that these editors, propagandists, would attack its most threatening targets earlier and more frequently. And also likewise, they will make their strongest arguments earlier and more frequently. This leads me to do a series I'll tell you, this was an observation that I made. This is not data driven, it was very subjective. But it comes from reading all the issues of Davik. I saw that in the first issue of Davik, Daesh attacks figures that are most similar to them. There's a kind of the layperson in the US, I've heard, tends to think that Islamic State most hates and fears Christians or the West. But in fact, they hit the targets that are most similar to them: Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia, the muftis, the state-sanctioned muftis. They don't actually get to attacking Christians until the 15th and final issue. Likewise, Jews, and Shia in the same sort of order. So that was not data-driven, it was an observation, so I started to crunch the data. I threw all the text of these issues of Davik into a program called NVivo and started looking at it. This is a cross-section, this is across the entire publication run of Davik. This turquoise is mentions of Islam and variations of that word. So a full 75%, and Jews and Christians barely, rate a mention throughout. Now this is types of arguments. For the sake of time, I'm not going to interpret all the Arabic terms, but if you take out Christianity and Judaism and the term tagut, which means a secular leader, usually a government official, like a head of state typically, take out those three terms, all of these actually refer to Islam or deviance within Islam, that ISIS considers these people to have perverted the faith or left the faith or deviated. Let me look at my statistic I had for this one. So it's 74% of the arguments, the religious theological arguments that Islamic State makes in Davik are all interfaith, not it's co-religion. So what I'm doing, my point is, I'm allowing Islamic State to identify the figures that it most fears in its propaganda. Does that make sense? Because if they don't consider them a threat to their propaganda, then they're not going to bother with them. Or if they do, it will be much later in the publication run. This is a longitudinal study as opposed to the cross-sectional. This is issue by issue. These are mentions of Islam, and I make the assumption that I would have predicted that if the mentions of, say, Judaism and Christian, by the way, I'm not mentioning other religions because they didn't. They mentioned Hindus and Buddhists like once each. So if the line generally goes up, then I make the assumption that it's less important. So mentions of Judaism generally go up toward the end. This is mentions of Christian. Now you will notice that this is Islam, and so it does generally go up. But I crunched the numbers a different way and took a look at the percentage of religious arguments. Like this is all of the religious arguments, cross-section of the first issue. 54% is Islam, and you could lump in all these other terms besides Jews and Christians. And then to go to the final issue, and the trend goes from 54% about Islam to 37%. So with a downward slant, we're saying that it's more important, in fact, because they would have made more arguments earlier. So what I've concluded is the data supports the co-religionist hypothesis. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, if you have limited resources, which we all do, you have to decide. You could do a multi-pronged approach and have interfaith operations first, and then also co-religionist operations. Or if, like I said, if your funds are limited and you can only do one, you should go for co-religionists as to recruit. as your counter propagandists. If you're dealing with religious fundamentalists, you have to appeal to the sacred texts, because that's what matters to these people that are susceptible to radicalization. If they're prone to being a fundamentalist, they care about what's in the text. And you would use these co-religionists to make these arguments. And then therefore, secular arguments and interveners are dramatically less effective, and interfaith non-co-religionists can help, but are also less effective. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
So in your study here, a co-religionist though would be like a very specific type of Muslim, right?
That's a good question.
Because it seemed, you were saying like the people they most fear and talk about the most are other Muslims, so we couldn't use them, right?
Right. And it's on a scale, is what I'm finding.
Okay.
If you notice the two religions that they do bother picking on, they're all of what they say people of the book, Abrahamic traditions, which would mean they're kind of in the same category. They're not the same, but they have similar traditions. So even then, they're still like Hinduism and Buddhism is just too out there that it's not a threat to them, is my analysis. So yes, going even within Islam, I am dealing with terms like co-sect or co-fundamentalist. Like on my kind of that series of concentric rings, like they didn't even get to pick on Shia for an entire issue till the two from the last issue, because they're just like, well, of course Shia are non-Muslim, so they started out picking on Al-Qaeda and pointing out like differences between them. They're an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but why are we different? What is our legitimacy? So groups like Al-Qaeda, as you get closer and closer to their actual identity, these groups that are closer tend to threaten their legitimacy more than a group that's out here. That makes sense?
I'm curious, thinking not necessarily internationally with Daesh, but it sounds extraordinarily similar to some of the things we're seeing in the US, and I'm curious if there is any indication in the literature as to whether the same approach would work with, say, domestic terror groups, as well as it seems to be working or could work with international groups.
That's a really good question. Are you referring to like white supremacists?
For the most, white nationalists, white supremacists.
White nationalists,
right, yeah.
Yes, in fact, I'm no longer with the Carter Center, but when I was there last, they were talking about a pivot to expand their focus from just Islamic violence or militancy to just broaden the perspective. Because for one, it's pretty racist to only I'm not saying that, no, but like that, no, I love the Carter Center. Please don't misunderstand. But like to narrowly focus only on violence that's done by one particular group, it doesn't make sense. And so the last I heard, they were trying to make a pivot to expand. And I totally agree with that, because Christianity has its fundamentalists, and some of them are violent. Hinduism has its fundamentalists, and some of them are violent. And even religions that people might not associate with violence as much. If you look in Myanmar, there are Buddhists who slaughter Muslims. So no religion is immune to this, it goes back to the ambivalence of the sacred. You can use a religion for peace or for violence. Yeah.
How'd you get your hands on the Dabiq newsletter? Did you have to go on the dark web?
They used to only be on the dark web. And then programs like Clarion Project started taking them and compiling them, and now they're pretty easy to get. I don't know if I would recommend that you.
No, I'm certainly not.
I'm not sure.
I was just very
I had to
curious
get
how
a
you
letter.
ended up doing that sort of textual analysis.
Yeah, I had to get a letter it for like, for flying, so I can show them like I do this for the Carter Center.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's like, why did you visit all these sites? Like,
Yeah.
your computer's chock full of like some of the foulest stuff there is. I mean, but yes, you're head up.
Yeah, so do you think the co-religionist hypothesis would be more effective in cases such as this when, groups have a similar religious background versus, in instances where two groups have a less, similar religious background, so the two groups are both of the book versus a monotheistic and a polytheistic religion?
Yeah, basically. Mhm.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh,
Me? Oh, no, no.
all right. Thank you very much.